Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi. In our last episode, we talked about Rafael Rosengarten's graduate studies at Yale and his postdoctoral work at the Joint Bioenergy Institute, where a mix of collaboration and access to cutting-edge technology sparked his passion for synthetic biology. If you missed it, be sure to go back and listen to part 2. In part 3, Rafael takes us through his move from the Joint Bioenergy Institute to Baylor College of Medicine, where personal commitments and a vibrant medical community informed his next moves. We'll hear about his work in synthetic biology, a transformative collaboration that bridged biology and machine learning, and how these experiences led to the founding of Genialis. Rafael candidly shares the challenges of pivoting the company's focus, ultimately positioning Genialis as a leader in predictive biomarker development for precision oncology.
And you mentioned, moving and leaving JBay. When did you know it was time to leave?
Oh, it had nothing to do with work. I would have stayed for much longer. I would have at least put in another year or so before, looking to join a friend's company or something. It was more personal reason stuff. So my girlfriend became a fiance. Her work took her. She was doing a rotational program like every 6-7 months. She actually went to Venezuela for her work. So I stayed in the Bay Area, but we kind of made a deal. It's like, if you can get back to the US, I'll just come find you. And so that was Houston. Right. So all oil pipelines lead back to Houston. And so she ended up back in Houston, and I drove back out here and we got married. And so I figured I'd just figure it out here. Houston, not everyone knows this, has the world's largest medical center. I don't know how many institutions now, but when I came here, it was like 68 or 69, shoulder to shoulder. A friend of mine once described it as Vegas for hospitals. Like, it's just, it's nuts. I mean, it employs over 150,000 people just in the medical center alone. And so if you have training in biomedicine, it's not hard to find a job here. And I was able to apply for and get a postdoc fairly readily at Baylor College of Medicine, which is a historically phenomenal institution, right? Like really, really storied human molecular genetics department, in the lab of Gad Shulsky and Adam Kuspa, who worked on yet another weird critter, an organism called Dictyostelium. It's a cellular slime mold, doing non-self recognition. So I basically left all the synthetic biology stuff behind, at least in terms of the biofuels, went back to the problem space that I'd finished my graduate career on, but in yet another organism. But I still wanted to do the tools, and I love the synthetic biology. So, and they kind of hired me for that. So I wanted to just innovate. Like, can we do better tools, better, can we do the science faster, better? And in fact, I had the best result. I postdoc there for 4 years. I had my best experimental result like 3 months in, where I was able to achieve something with molecular cloning of Dictyostelium DNA, which is like 80% AT rich, which most people won't understand what that means. But the composition of the genome is highly skewed towards one set of chemistries than the other, and it makes it fragile. So it's hard to work with. And I figured out how to work with it. No one else had been able to do that. I never came close to being that successful in the lab again for 3.5 more years. You kind of shoot your shot, but
yeah.
But at any rate, I was able to get this postdoc with some wonderful mentors. I don't know if I'm good at picking them or they're good at picking me, but really wonderful people to work for. Again, same characteristics, completely committed to the career trajectories of their trainees, stable in their own work, no egos at all involved, very open-minded to let you set your own course, right? And excited to help you do that. And I put my head down and I did that, but I knew, and this was kind of the weird part, like, this isn't going to be my career. This isn't going to be my forever job. And, I had to kind of figure out how to figure out what's next. But in the meantime, my wife, who was very supportive of all of this, she was on a pretty awesome trajectory in her job. And so, I was comfortable saying, listen, I'm going to keep doing science, and I'm going to keep doing it in a way that remains geographically flexible. So if we want to go overseas for your work, I'll figure it out. Right. And so I had her blessing and support, but also, the stability, financial stability, life stability, family stability, to continue to be a dilettante and open-minded and not destination focused, right? Like I was just kind of along for the ride.
Very cool. And when you think about, I guess, were there any cultural or like, yeah, cultural and lab cultural, personally, professionally, when comparing Baylor to JBay, like in that experience? Or were they very actually quite similar? You just happen to find
No,
another
night and day
JBay and
different. Like I don't even know how to begin to compare them. Um, you know, Baylor College of Medicine was a much more traditional, like biomedical research place with proper departments and grown-up supervision and HR policies, and but also, at least in some ways more resource constrained. They were very well-heeled HHMI labs, right? Howard Hughes Medical Institute labs, where I imagine the budgets were just kind of off the wall and you could do whatever. But it wasn't the same. You weren't playing with like government paper money.
Interesting. And and when you mentioned the kind of like finding your hit in the first 3 months, I always imagine this like you're like, all right, now I need to do like it's like a musician in their sophomore album. They're
Mhm.
like, crap, how the hell how do I just beat what I just released just now? And you're just like, the
Yeah.
pressure's high and you're just like, it's intense.
Well, yeah, I kept doing science, and part of what I had released was a tool. So I got to keep collaborating with other kids, with other people in the lab. Um, but what happened at Baylor that was so instrumental in my life was actually it was a funding thing. So again, I was working in this weird. It's not that it's not a non-model organism system. It is a model, but it's not a traditional biomedical model. And so funding was always going to be tighter. And so I needed to get a fellowship, right? And my mentor proposed to me that I apply for this NIH fellowship through the National Library of Medicine for biomedical informatics. And what was special about this fellowship, there were a few things. One is it was administered through an umbrella organization called the Gulf Coast Consortium, which was a partnership of 6 member organizations in Houston. Baylor College of Medicine was one. I want to say University of Houston, Rice, probably UT Health. I'm going to screw it up. I don't remember all of them, but anyway, so it was this multi-organization umbrella, and it required that you have a primary mentor sponsor, but a co-mentor from a different discipline. And the overall thrust was to pair bench scientists with computationalists and vice versa. So if you were a lab scientist, your co-mentor would be a bioinformatician or a data scientist or whatever, and you would figure out a project that used both sets of skills. And I was a life scientist, so I had to find people to work with on the computational side. So that was a big piece of it. Um, at the same time, my academic lab at Baylor had a long-standing collaboration with a data science team, computer science group in Ljubljana, Slovenia, at the University of Ljubljana.
Hmm.
So probably most Americans couldn't point to it on a map. I'll give you the hint. It's at the very top of the Adriatic, nestled between Italy and Croatia, just south of Austria, right? It turns out that some of the most important concepts in machine learning and advanced mathematics grew up in that part of the world. And as it turns out, there's a brilliant youngish faculty member at University of Ljubljana who had done a master's at University of Houston and somehow gotten a faculty position that he kept at Baylor College of Medicine. And he would come over for a few months every year and he would bring students. And so I had the good fortune of being at this lab at Baylor when Professor Blaž Zupan came over from Slovenia, and he brought with him a woman named Marinka Zipnik. Marinka may or may not be the smartest mathematician of her generation in the world. I just mean in the world.
Holy
Like this,
crap.
yeah. Like, and I don't mean to exaggerate. Like she's just next level brilliant. She's currently on the faculty at Harvard. She had done her PhD in Ljubljana, a postdoc at Stanford, and she keeps just racking up awards and publishing the most incredible stuff at Harvard. But they came over, and this is 2011, right? So they came over to do work in our lab, and they actually came for a year. And the idea was they had invented all these new technologies that the machine learning techniques and mathematics that predate what we now know as like large language models or autoencoders and all these major machine learning AI concepts that you can't like walk down the street without tripping over now, in both in the consumer realm and in the life sciences. But this was 2011, right? Like most people didn't know about this. And so all of us in the lab at the bench got to team up with them to think, all right, how can we design some in silico experiments to make some predictions that we can then test in the lab and create a nice little feedback loop of making predictions, testing the lab, making predictions, and advance both of our science. And so I got to work every day one-on-one with Blaj and with Marinka on what we now know is is at the cutting edge, the absolute forefront of machine learning. Just to give you a little bit of like point in time, Recursion Pharma, which is arguably the most famous of the tech bio pharma, it opened its doors in 2013. So this is 2 years before that. In Silico Medicine opened its doors, if I'm not mistaken, in 2013, 2 years before that. Benevolent AI, 2013. So this was early days of machine learning and life sciences, right? So I had this fellowship, or I got this fellowship. I had these collaborators, and I was like, all right, I'm going to put all this together, right? I'm going to make this my postdoc. There was also a cool technology coming out of the Slovenian group where they had built a prototype or an MVP of this lab software for omics analysis, right? So I'm still doing high throughput sequencing, still doing the data analysis, but here's what we would call nowadays a code-free solution, right? Point and click, super interactive software for playing with the data. And so as a bench biologist who really shouldn't be allowed to code, this was brilliant for me, right? Like I could design experiments, do this. And so I was just immersed in this world of software and data science. And it blew my mind. I mean, I drank the Kool-Aid and I went back for seconds and thirds and fourths, right? The fellowship required that I do some interdisciplinary training. So the fellowship administrator, who I always say this, I owe her everything in my career, but God, at the time it felt like torture. She made me go sit and audit a statistical machine learning class at Rice, which has a very strong applied mathematics department. I hadn't taken a mathematics class since freshman year of college, right? But man, it opened my eyes. But what it allowed me to do is have conversations, right? So I didn't have to learn how to do machine learning. I had to learn how to talk to people who knew how to do machine learning, right? So I'm not giving this period of my life enough credit in the narrative, but in terms of all the events that took place. But one of the events was another one of Blaj's students came over. His name was Miha Stajdahar. He had just finished his PhD in artificial intelligence and had started this little company with two other guys in Slovenia called Genialis, and they were going to license some technology from Blaj's lab and do something with it. That's all they knew. And so Blaj got the company sort of early access to Baylor. I don't remember all the terms because I wasn't really involved, but basically Micha and one other early employee, a bioinformatician, could come over to Baylor, and Baylor would hire them as postdocs to build software that did some bioinformatics, did some AI, kind of combined all this for labs at Baylor, right? And so I was customer zero for this. I was like the earliest customer for some of these tools. And again, drinking the Kool-Aid, like full-throated support of this stuff. It was awesome. I knew I wanted to work on this. I knew I wanted to take this machine learning and figure out problems to solve with it. And Micha and I went rock climbing and camping one weekend up in hill country outside of Austin. And he proposed to me in the tent. He said, why don't you come join us, right? So 1 year into his 2-year stint in Houston, I was already kind of at the end of the postdoc. I left my postdoc, joined the company by way of becoming a founder because the company wanted a US footprint. They wanted a US headquarters. They wanted someone on all three of the other founders were from other domains. They wanted someone who understood biomedicine and life sciences. For some reason, they recruited a washed up marine biologist, line cook, who didn't know anything about biomedicine or entrepreneurship. Like I had no business sense, no commercial sense. Never a day in my life have I worked in a lab that solved an actual medical problem, right? But God, I believed in the technology.
And I can see kind of this like recurring kind of theme of, well, the first one is kind of like, I think it ties back to like just like following your curiosity, but also you seem to have been on, I've been using the term ground floor of these like early waves. Like you're at Yale during like the next gen sequencing kind of like boom.
Right.
And you were at the ground floor at J-Bay for synthetic biology. And then now you're kind of at the ground floor of
for AI,
ML. And I've always tried to figure out like, can you manufacture this, or is there a way to manufacture serendipity? And I think it's kind of like, at least what it seems to me,
Hmm.
that it comes back to that curiosity and following, and also just like fun, adventurous stuff. Because
Hmm.
like if you follow that, like, and you try to tap into that fun adventure,
Yeah.
you tend to find yourself in places like this.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, the truth is, if I had been 2 years shifted in any direction, I probably still would have been at the forefront of something big and important. And this is, I think, how science moves. The funny thing is, at each of these stages, when you like would read the scientific history, it felt like all the important problems were solved already. But of course,
Yeah.
none of them were, right? Like, or
Yeah.
it's nonsense because there are always important problems. Here's it, like I had nothing to do with CRISPR. I've actually never done CRISPR with my own two hands, right? I was out of the lab and kind of doing in silico stuff before it was commonplace. So I missed CRISPR as an innovation to actually use in my own research. So I didn't hit all of them, right? But if I had been 2 years later, I would have been there for the early days of CRISPR, right? Or if I had been 2 years earlier, it might have been something different. But I think this is why, like, being okay with not having a plan and being comfortable just like chasing your passion is a pretty good survival skill. Like it's a pretty good approach to these things. If if you have faith and some amount of like security that like things will work out.
Absolutely. At least, and I can say from my experience too, is just like it can be like, not to say that it's like uncertainty can
Hmm.
definitely be anxiety inducing, that's for sure. But, you know, and it's a bit, overly simplistic or just maybe trite, or where I'm like, it'll all work itself out, because sometimes it doesn't. And so I don't mean to overly simplify it, but at least for me, when I have kind of tapped into that element of just
Right.
like going into the unknown, I'm usually underlined,
Yeah.
pleasantly surprised with what I find.
Yeah. I mean, that it's not lost on me. This a little bit of like comes from a position of privilege, right? I think you and I both have the first couple tiers of our Maslow's hierarchy of whatever are pretty well taken care of. So we can bask in the upper levels and just, really go for self-actualization. But even people with who maybe need it to work out for the sake, for economic reasons or whatever, who are willing to kind of trust that it will. I think diving into the process is usually better than fixating on a goal, on an endpoint.
Absolutely. And so now we're kind of like, the Genialis is like now a thing.
Right.
You are now the kind of the starting point of the US kind of footprint. Can you talk a little bit about, or more about, Genialis, like the driving force for Genialis, the mission and focus, and more about you and your founding team?
Yeah. Think about how to do this. It's not a simple story, and there are different versions of it depending on the audience. The company has a lot of different origins. So again, there are this trio of guys in Slovenia who kind of started a company because they wanted to do a company. They didn't really know which technology they were going to use. They certainly didn't know what problem they were going to solve. They just knew they wanted to do entrepreneurship. But I kind of respect that in a way. They wanted to get into the process and they had a good intuition for where to look for the technology, right? The sort of the AI wave was coming. And they had a sense that life sciences, biotech, biomedicine had a lot of unsolved problems. So all three of those were good intuitions. Um, when I joined up October 2015, I'd like to I like to talk about that as like the company's still in stealth. I mean, it had a website. It existed in Slovenia, but it didn't exist in the US yet. And we kind of kept it in stealth here because we wanted to see if we could go after non-dilutive funding. So the way we actually did it is I started a Genialis Inc. in Texas that actually was unaffiliated with the Slovenian one, except for some tech transfer agreements, because I needed to be able to go after NIH money. So we couldn't have 75% of the cap table be Slovenian, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so we kept this kind of weird parallel thing for about a year. We applied for an NIH or NSF. It was one of the SBIRs. I don't even remember which. And the idea was to take this machine learning that I've been doing with Marinka Zitnik, with not with my co-founder, but with this other Slovenian scientist, which at this point was a published and open source technology, right? So to take that and start building AI models that would really learn basic cancer biology. It would learn fundamental cancer biology through the relationship of lots of otherwise unrelated pieces of data. So this is going to become important when we fast forward to today. The original vision, my original vision for what we were going to do was to build integrated data models of all of cancer biology from, it wasn't big data. It was loads of small data, right? All the small data we get our hands on, right? Because at the time, there was really no such thing as big data in biology. At the time, nothing was that high throughput. And then apply that to intractable cancer domains like glioblastoma and pediatric medulloblastoma and others in order to be able to figure out new targets, but also subset patient populations for the right therapies and stuff. This was the original idea. And we submitted that for funding, came very close. We got a very good score, missed the funding cutoff by a little bit. And because we'd missed the funding cutoff by a little bit, we had to figure out what the business was going to be. But at the time, we also had this software prototype. And we were able to sell a single enterprise license to that software for enough money, because the company was small and we were paying ourselves next to nothing. In fact, my wife's only thing was, yes, you can do it, but don't earn less than you did as a postdoc, right? So I was basically earning my postdoc salary plus $1.
Yeah.
Right. So that enterprise software deal made us think, well, look, there seems to be a commercial market for this software. Why don't we do that? And I was brought in as a co-founder, but the head of product, chief product officer, because again, of my co-founders had this delusion that I somehow knew what we should be making. And so the founding CEO, who's still a good friend of mine, although he's not with the company anymore, he had this vision of building a big scalable SaaS company, right? Now, there was another trend in the industry at the time. Andreessen Horowitz had recently entered the life science investing market. And Andreessen Horowitz, this juggernaut Silicon Valley fund, they had made their name, and they're not investing in SaaS companies, and had this mantra, software is going to eat the world. And they like, we're going to take this software model and apply it to biotech and change how things are done. So there are all these companies starting up at that time who tried to build a SaaS business. Only one of them that I can think of actually did well with that. The rest of us tried, built beautiful software, but could not make the business model work for various reasons. And there are loads of us, like us, Envisagenics, Cyclica, lots and lots of others who started out in that space and then had to pivot into a more discovery mode. Like we had to build things that had more intrinsic value closer to discovery, whether those are drugs or AI models or whatever. We can get back to that. But yeah, it really didn't work, but we tried. So we were building this SaaS business around the software. We kind of put the machine learning on the back burner because you have to have focus as a startup, right? Strategy is not what you do, it's what you don't do. And so we decided, all right, we're going to put our heads down. We had some early customers for the software. It was beautiful software, really worked well. We have a brilliant designer. She still works for the company and has runs the department around communication. And so we were trying to build this kind of like no code, low code informatics software that would allow people to do machine learning, but also had a really robust coding engine for the bioinformatician wonks. We built it. We launched partnerships with Roche, with Thermo Fisher. We had some big splashes, got some big name customers, but could not make the unit economics work. My co-founder CEO colleague managed to raise a proper institutional seed round. Now, this would have been pre-seed in today's parlance. It was like 2.5 million, a little less, almost nothing compared to the seed rounds you've seen in the last 5 years. But enough for us to do a proper commercial launch of the software, grow the team's headcount, and prove that we were going to run out of money and couldn't sell the sucker. Right. And so that was the first couple of years of the company. The first 2.5 years, 3 years, loads of fun, tons of learnings. Again, I didn't know anything about business. When he told me he wanted me to be the chief product officer, I was like, absolutely, I'm all for it. We got off the phone, and I literally went and Googled, what is a chief product officer? Yeah. I'm not even kidding. And I spent the next week like reading all of the product blogs from Silicon Valley, what does it mean to be, and reading there's some great books on this books like Hooked and books, Delighted, and books about how you actually build products for customers, right? How do you find out what a problem to solve is and solve it? Great training, but our product, people loved it. It still exists. We still use it. We still sell it. We just couldn't get the economics to work, right? The SaaS business model wasn't the right business model for what we were doing.
Interesting. And I had a similar experience too when I was first starting Exeter.
Hmm.
And this was like when like Mark Andreessen was still blogging. So like P Markup and
Right.
like
Yeah, yeah.
the Union Square Ventures too, all of the blogs out of there. And then I was like, one of my co-founder, he's like, go learn how to do sales. And I remember I was a bench scientist. I was like, I Googled how to do sales. And
Hmm.
they're just like, I'm
Hmm.
just like, how do I do this? And then proceeded to just learn, just like trial by fire on how to do it. Obviously, doing, and I think too, like even though this first iteration or this first V1 of Genialis and the SaaS model wasn't what you ended up sticking to. Exactly what you said. These experiences are all accretive. It's like they all add to your general repertoire and make you a more formidable entrepreneur.
Yeah.
As long as you can, like, again, kind of what we're talking about, like get through that wall or like make the pivot. And so when you were there, can you
Hmm.
talk a little bit about that experience of doing the pivot?
Yeah. So, I'm going to flash forward a little bit. Now we're in 2018, right? So we raised our financing at the end of 2017. I consider that sort of coming out of stealth, right? We had a big launch. Um, we grew the company way too big. And when it was clear that we were running out of money, um, the leadership team got together and we're like, we need a pivot. We need to figure out something else to do. And so the founding CEO um, had the courage and the self-awareness to be like, I don't know what to do next. And because I was the only one of the four of us who had a PhD in the field we were trying to sell into, they kind of nominated me to be the CEO to go out and just talk to the market, right? Like in their own language, find out what problems we could solve. Now, we had done two things really well. We had built really high quality software that did solve a real problem, right? It was built to aggregate, process, visualize, and manage next gen sequencing data, which was now starting to reach the high throughput scale that you needed for machine learning. And we knew from the early days that the reason we built the software in the first place is if you wanted to do the AI bit, you had to have the data. You had to get the data in one place. And we just got sort of, I'll say, sidetracked because we thought we could sell the software as the business rather than doing the second part. Um, so in the summer of 2018, I took over as the CEO. The other thing we'd done really well is we built a brilliant team, like really, really high quality engineers, scientists, mostly in Slovenia, which at the time had sort of a salary arbitrage opportunity. It was less expensive, but that was changing too as more global opportunities were coming about. So we were a pretty big team. We were like 30 people that summer, with dwindling funds. And so the first thing I did as CEO, more or less, is I cut headcount by 50%, which was awful. Like I had to fire a lot of my friends. And the next thing I did is I told the remaining 15 people in the room, I'm cutting your salaries in half. Who's with me? And everybody stayed. And so we went back to salad days. We went back to sweat equity days, right? And, it was tough. Like I went and I said, I remember I went over to Slovenia and I said, listen, I don't know what we're going to do exactly, but we're going to go find out. Here are the things we've built that work really well. Here's what I think are the coming opportunities. And we're going to wander into this dark woods. And if you follow me, we'll come out the other side. And everyone did. And I don't remember the exact sequencing of this, but around Christmas of 2018. So we had been kind of taking a lot of meetings with a lot of biotechs and figuring out what problems we could solve for them. I had kind of figured it out. There was a confluence of some things happening. So first of all, biotech investments were starting to heat up. End of 2018, this is when like interest rates were pretty low for a while. Capital was starting to feel kind of free. Stock markets were all right. People, venture capital is starting to come into biotech a little faster than it had before. The other thing is that immune checkpoint inhibitors had proved their worth, and the fight was fierce, right? But Keytruda was starting to emerge as the winner, but everyone and their brother wanted to develop a combination therapy with Keytruda or Nivo or one of the other ones. And so I talked to a lot of biotech execs, and what I learned was these drugs had a ton of money coming at them for clinical development. These drugs did not actually work for that many people. For the people they work for, they work really well, but they only work for a few people. And we could use our technology. We could use a combination of the software, but also get back into this AI bit that I loved so much and we could do the thing that I had written into that SBIR grant 3.5 years earlier, which was, let's build some models and figure out who's going to benefit from these drugs. And sure enough, we got a couple small service contracts to build predictive models to kind of reanalyze some retrospective clinical trial data and see if we could predict post hoc who would have done well on these drugs. And so I wrote a note to the team at the end of 2018. I said, this is what we're going to be for the next phase. We are going to be the predictive biomarker company for immune oncology, right? And it needs us badly. And so we started getting service revenue. And by the middle of 2019, we were break even. And we could start paying ourselves real salaries again. And we were able to just grow in revenue. By the end of 2019, we had forged a really good collaboration with a company called Oncology Therapeutics. It doesn't exist anymore. It didn't survive the Biotech winter. It's been recapitalized as another entity, but they were a therapeutics company with some drugs that played in the tumor microenvironment related to the immune oncology, and a vision for building a predictive biomarker system using RNA sequencing data, which is what we had as a company specialized in it by that point. And so by the end of 2019, a year after I drafted this memo that we were going to be the biomarker company for immune oncology, we were the RNA biomarker company, not necessarily for just IO, but we were really good at building predictive models using transcriptomics data, using RNA-seq data. And we had solved some of the really hard, but incredibly boring and unflashy problems around using gene expression data in a clinical context. And loads of people have been playing with gene expression signatures for various uses. There are a lot of risk scores out there, activation scores out there. There are very few clinical devices that use it. And at the time, there were none, really. And we cracked the nut on some very, again, hard but boring problems that I don't think anyone else had solved. And that was sort of the aha moment, right? We did it in this collaboration with Oncology. I will forever be grateful to the CEO, Laura Benjamin, who took a bet on us and became a good friend of mine in the process. I remember meeting up with her at JP Morgan 2020, and we shook hands on a year-long pact to bring their biomarker to market with their drug. And by the end of 2020, we had an FDA-accepted biomarker for use in their pivotal clinical trial. She went on to license it to 3 global diagnostics companies for CDX development and other development. And we were working with lots of other biotechs to do retrospective studies to potentially use it for other drugs, not just Oncology's drugs. This thing worked like gangbusters. Genialis has since been a co-author on studies of over 15,000 patient samples in retrospective studies across 12 different solid tissues for, I think we're up to 8 different drugs, maybe 9 drugs, half approved, the other half not approved. And in every case, this biomarker model works to enrich for patient response to drugs hitting the tumor microenvironment, from everything from checkpoint inhibitors to VEGF and back again. And we really learned how to do what we do now through the course of that work. But maybe more to the point, we built the technology engine that we have today, through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But that was the discovery process of what are we going to be when we grow up.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast, featuring Rafael Rosengarten. Be sure to tune in for part 4 as Rafael reflects on scaling Genialis, navigating the biotech industry during the COVID-19 pandemic, and pioneering cancer diagnostics with AI and machine learning. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeda or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeda or its guests.